Who are the characters behind science? This is Science Behind the Glass, illuminating the human side.
In this podcast, we unveil the human side of laboratories and science. Scientists share personal experiences and we discuss their meanings from different perspectives and fields of research.
Welcome to Science Behind the Glass, illuminating the human side. We explore the stories behind the science and the people shaping our world with curiosity, courage, and purpose. Today, we dive into global crises that become so visible we almost stop seeing it. Plastic pollution. It's in our oceans, in fish we eat, in the air we breathe, and yet the systems behind it remain stubbornly unchanged.
But what if we could see the problem clearly? Not just in the headlines of beach cleanups, but through science and data and long term visions. What if we could hold corporations and governments accountable, not just with the outage, but with facts and urgency?
To help us do just that, we are joined by Laurent Lebreton, head of research at the Ocean Cleanup, a visionary organization tackling the plastic problem at a scale. Laurent is one of the leading researchers behind the science of plastic accumulation in our oceans, from the infamous Great Pacific Garbage Patch to the rivers feeding it.
Laurent's journey began with ocean's physics and numerical models. But over the last decade, he's turned that expertise towards one of the planet's most urgent challenges, mapping and confronting plastic pollution at a global scale. His research has transformed our understanding of where ocean plastic comes from and how it moves and what it will take to stop it.
Thank you, Laurent, for joining us to Science Behind the Glass. It's a pleasure having you here. Thank you for accepting the invitation. To start off,
pleasure.
you are from New Zealand, and how does those early years inspire you to or influence you to study or to work with the ocean?
Yeah, so first, I am not from New Zealand. I've lived in New Zealand for nearly 20 years in a little place called Raglan, but originally I'm French. With a name like this, you'd guess I'm from France. So I lived in New Zealand for maybe 20 years by the sea. But before that, I was studying in France. My family is actually from a small island called Réunion Island, which is in the Indian Ocean next to Madagascar. And so my whole life I've been spending a lot of time at sea, and my move to New Zealand also was motivated by that beautiful place called Raglan, which is a very famous surfing spot. And I've always had my hair salty, and it's always been something very, very special to me. And when I was studying, I was always been attracted by science and math and physics, and always wanted to combine the both, right? So physics and the ocean. So I became an oceanographer.
Great. Thank you, Laurent. So in 2010, you made a big change in your career from like oil spilling modeling, plastic pollution. So my question is, what was it about the marine debris that grabbed your attention? And how did it feel entering a field that was still a blank canvas, as you described it in your own words?
So I was a coastal scientist. Mostly I was modeling, so I was developing numerical models for oil spills, but other sort of pollutants, or like sediment plume from dredging, fish larvae, those kind of things. And back then I was working for a company. We actually were contracted by a non-for-profit in California that was interested to study the motion of marine debris. And I used our model that we were essentially developing for oil spills, and I changed it to make it a global scale model and to study the transport of marine debris at global scale and reproduce the formation of what we call garbage patches. So in subtropical gyres, 5 of them in the ocean, in the global oceans, there are areas where currents accumulate floating debris. And so, that was the beginning of it. I was pushed by one of my colleagues back then to publish those results, and I did. And that was the beginning of a real big adventure. And as from there, I started to to cooperate with other scientists. And the field of plastic pollution and marine debris was existing, already from the 70s, 80s. People started to report on this, but it really accelerated, I think, in the late 2000s, early 2010, and now it's a very, very active field of research. But yeah, at that time it really felt like there was a lot of things to do, and yeah, that just dragged me really into that career.
And then you start working with Boyan just directly because influence of your colleagues, or how do you find this opportunity for working?
So I published my first paper was in 2012, and it was essentially a model that was reproducing the garbage patch formation. And Boyan at that time, I think he founded the Ocean Cleanup in 2013, and so had the vision of trying to remove plastic from the garbage patches. And so he got in touch with me asking me about data and results from the model. And so I've always believed in open access science, and so I've just essentially distributed my data to him, and I said, well, here you go, good luck. And from there we started discussing, and I started working for the Ocean Cleanup really in 2016. So there was a few years of just discussion, and eventually got me to join the adventure.
And that's when your modeling just help to predict the cleanups of the tackling these areas, and how these work and what areas get more attention thanks to the modeling that you use.
So at the moment at the Ocean Cleanup, we develop essentially two types of model. One is for the ocean, so trying to understand where persistent floating plastic pollution accumulates. And so, like I was saying, it was very offshore area, remote area, in things called subtropical gyres. So there's 5 of them in each major ocean basins at subtropical latitude. The largest accumulation of those is in the North Pacific, in a place that we call the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, halfway between the state of Hawaii and the state of California. So this is where the Ocean Cleanup has been focusing their efforts in terms of ocean collection of marine debris. The other part of modeling that we work on is trying to understand the emission of plastic from land to the ocean. So that's the second part of the mission of the Ocean Cleanup, is to try to intercept plastic before it reaches the ocean. And the rivers, we often say, are the arteries that bring plastic pollution from land to the ocean. So we try to develop models that predict how much plastic is coming from which rivers. And so that helps us essentially target locations where we want to deploy solutions, things called interceptors, that are stopping the flow of plastic pollution before it reaches the ocean.
Yeah, absolutely. That's and just going a little bit about your body of research, the rivers as a key path to the plastic pollution. So, what has been the biggest misconception people have about plastic, where it comes from, and how can science shift public understanding? What has been the misconception that you felt that the general public has had?
In terms of science and then communication of results, there were early results of models that were predicting contribution of different rivers. And I think one of the first paper to come out was that there was about 10 rivers that were contributing 90% of the problem. So people were just like, wow, easy, just like target those 10 rivers and job's done. But that was early research, and so we've started to really investigate the problem, and we realized that the problem was much more sort of complex in terms of geographical diversity. And so now we estimate about 1,000 rivers contributing about 80% of the problem of plastic coming from rivers. So it's a bigger number, but also 1,000 rivers is less than 1% of the total rivers in the world, right? So there's still there's still a small fraction of leakage points where we're trying to focus on. And what we found is that this was not necessarily the largest river, like big continental rivers, that was contributing the largest amount of plastic pollution, but mostly coastal urban waterways in developing economies in Southeast Asia and Central America, in West Africa. So those are really like the areas where we need to focus in the years to come to make sure that we're not sort of spilling that much plastic into the ocean.
Yes, because actually it's very funny because if you think about the coastal cities, we could say like well, most of the or the majority of the cities are coastal that we live in. For example, Australia. I'm not sure if like a developed countries have the same problems. I know that you mentioned now that compared to South America and Central America, but what about the other cities or main cities that are in the coastal areas with developing countries? It happens the same or is not the same amount of
What do you mean?
plastic?
What do you mean? What about the other coastal cities?
For example, with developed countries, for example, in Australia or even in US, in all the coast, what about those coastal cities and the rivers that are contributing or falling into the ocean? What is the is not significant amount of plastic or doesn't matter compared to the other countries?
Mm. I mean, there is, definitely plastic coming from developed countries. I mean, we have an interceptor in Los Angeles that, is regularly collecting, quite significant amount of plastic. At global scale, though, you look at different countries, you really see that the problem is in regions that's not necessarily like the poorest country, but countries that have known in recent decade like a very fast sort of development where sort of the middle class is developing, growing, and so people start to buy more things, but the waste management system is not necessarily following at the same pace of the harder the middle class is growing, right? So those are like countries like Indonesia, like India, like many countries in Latin America, right? Where the infrastructure needs to follow, right? So in those countries, there's, some places like major part of the population don't have access to any sort of like waste management system. So, there's the whole system to bring them the goods, bring them plastic and other consumer goods, but there's no sort of system in place, infrastructure in place to actually take the waste, the resulting waste, right? And that's one of the main problem. Not That's not saying that plastic pollution doesn't occur in regions where waste managements are more developed, like Australia or the US or in Europe. But at scale, it's really in those like developing economies where the work needs to happen in the years to come.
And if we put in context, when we talk about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, it's more like a 500 jumbo jets worth of plastic floating in the ocean. So this is the
Mhm.
amount of plastic that we have in this garbage patch. And so what does data saying about this patch and what it doesn't say? What is hidden between all this rubbish, patch of rubbish?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll speak mostly about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch because this is where we've done like most of our research. We estimate about 100,000 tons of plastics, 100 million kilograms of floating plastics accumulated in this region. When you study plastic, there's sort of, like concentration of plastic pollution. There's sort of two units that you can use. One is the number of pieces per surface area, and so if you look at that unit, you will see like the majority of plastic is microplastic, small little fragments, up to millions of little fragments per square kilometers. The other unit you can use is the mass, right? So the kilograms per unit of surface area. And if you look at the mass of plastic, really like the majority of the mass is contained in larger objects. Things that are like, bigger than, several centimeters to like several meters, like giant ghost nets, we call it, like big fishing nets. And one thing that we've identified over the years is that, the majority of that mass of plastic is actually coming from fishing activity. So fish nets, I was saying, but also crates, buoys, fish traps, oyster spacers. So fishing aquaculture is one, big contributor to plastic in this specific area. One thing that we try to do then is to understand where is that plastic coming from. I mean, we understand the source, like it's fishing and aquaculture, but then we try to understand the origin in terms of geography, and then also the reason why this plastic is lost in the ocean and accumulates later in the ocean. And so when we look at the catch that we collect, we see that about half of it is made of nets, and the other half is made of rigid hard plastics. The hard plastics are quite useful because often, especially the big one, they have markings on it. So they have language, brands. There's also production dates. Quite often you find production dates. So production date will tell us about the age of the plastic and whether it's persistent or not. We find plastic in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch that was produced in the 60s, in the 70s, like from last century. So it tells you like how persistent that pollution is and that it's just not going away by itself, right? The other thing that we find is the origin in terms of language and different markings. And we find that, as expected, because we find a lot of debris from fishing, most of the origin that is found in the garbage patch is coming from countries that have large fishing fleet. So that would be Japan, China, Korea, the US, Taiwan. So that tells us, a little bit about, who is, sort of like responsible for that pollution. Things that we don't really know, for instance, fishing nets, like a large, like I was saying, like half of our collection is made of fishing nets. We still don't really know where those fishing nets are coming from, because fishing nets will not have any markings, will not have any clues of where it's coming. So that's something that's quite an active sort of field of research at the moment. We're investing quite some resources in trying to understand what are those nets, like what type of fishing techniques they are coming from. So is it like trolling, purse seines, long lines? And then which fleets are sort of like discarding those. And then I use discarded because that's also another thing we're trying to understand is like, what is the reason for those nets to end up in the ocean? They are, those nets, like they are costly. Like, we don't want to like assume that, fishermen just like release the nets and then like, we don't care, right? So we're trying to understand the reason why those nets are being lost. Are they lost? Are they abandoned? Are they discarded? So we take those giant bundle of nets, and then we try to detangle them all the way till like we have something flat. And then we look at the way it's being cut. And so sometimes it's sort of teared apart, sometimes it's cut. So it tells us whether it's like intentional or not intentional. And so we're working on this at the moment, but this is, some of the questions we still have to solve.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Laurent. So in regards to like these cleanup, what's a question that was arising for me is like your team when you approach these these cleanup processes, how do you go about with the marine life, the protection of it during these cleanups, and how do you ensure that they don't become part of this problem? What's the guys steps that you guys take?
Yeah, so I mean, there's different steps we take. Obviously, like we are collecting plastics mostly to leave the environment a better place. So we don't want the cure to be, the source of the problem. And it's quite interesting because when we develop our cleanup system, we are working with people that have a lot of experience in the fishing industry, right? But they always tell us is like, it's interesting because you're developing a system that actually doesn't want to fish. We want to fish plastic, but we don't want to remove like any sort of, marine life. So the way the cleanup system works is that it's a giant sort of like 2.5 kilometer long C-shaped system that is pulled very slowly by two vessels. So the vessel is essentially sort of moving at 1.5 knots. So just to give you an idea, if you're walking, 1.5 knots is about half the speed of about half the speed you are walking, right? So the system is moving very slowly. And then, so first, like, most animals can come in and out of the system. It's not kind of like sort of like raking everything out. And we have different sort of mitigation measures to make sure that marine life doesn't get trapped in it. We have light beacon, we have sound beacons, we have observers on board, mostly for marine mammals. I mean, what we see is like, marine mammals are like smart enough, like sometimes they're curious, but sometimes they just look at us and then they go away. Like, that's not a problem. One of the problem we have more is mostly with sea turtles, because they are a little bit more stupid, and they just come. And so at the end of the C shape, there is a sort of long, kind of a sock that we call a retention zone where plastic accumulates. And the biggest problem is you don't want sea turtles to be caught in that, right? So one thing that we know is that sea turtles follow certain currents depending on temperature. So we try to avoid those zones. Sometimes we still have some sea turtles coming, right? So what we have on the retention zone is cameras that can work at day and at night. And we have observers in the vessel, but also we use artificial intelligence to automatically detect if there is a sea turtle approaching the retention zone. If the sea turtle approaching, if there is a sea turtle approaching the retention zone, we have a system to actually lift up the retention zone, and there's actually a hole in there where they actually can swim out. So we've tested that at sea, and it actually works pretty good. So that's one more mitigation measure. And so yeah, we have different steps and environmental monitoring plan and environmental impact assessment in a way that we are trying to mitigate as much as possible our impact on marine life.
So you take samples when you collect from this C shape. You take samples, water samples, that in that way that you are not, for example, filtering the marine water, for example, collecting phytoplankton or microplankton, and then avoiding filtering the water for other animals. That's very cool.
That's correct. I mean, on top of our collection, we collect data with like smaller little nets, which are used. At first, they were actually used to study plankton, and this is how like things started. Like with oceanographers, they realized there were like more and more microplastics than plankton in those nets, right? But we kept conducting this collection, and we study an ecosystem called the Houston, which is a free-floating ensemble of animals that are free-floating just like plastic. And so we're trying to understand like what are the relation with the plastic, but also our cleanup system. So we collect data in front of the system, collect data at the back of the system, and we try to see like whether there is an impact. So far, we've proven there's actually like not much of an impact, whether we're in the front or at the back. The system that we are using has a net mesh size of 1.5 centimeters, so it's actually quite big. So we're really trying to go for the larger plastic and not the really small microplastic, which will be like really hard to like collect in the future. Now, what I was telling you before is that most of the plastic accumulated in the garbage patch is contained in larger plastic. That larger plastic will degrade into microplastics over time, right? So we want to remove it as soon as possible, but we're not going for the little microplastics. And the Houston essentially like passes through that system. Earlier this year, we published a study trying to look at the environmental benefits of cleaning the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. So we look at different aspects on how is plastic pollution impacting ecosystem in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. How is our cleanup impacting the ecosystem in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch? And we try to weigh like what is the positive or negative benefit over different like sort of species. Overall, what we found, the results were published in Nature scientific reports. That's the cleanup far outweighed the benefits and the risk of plastic pollution that has on this local ecosystem.
And that you mentioned, this is very, very important, because actually you have with not doing absolutely anything, and the damage that we already see, and the impact that we see in wildlife in general and marine life, but also there's also the afterwards that you are doing with this with the company. But also I remember that there's a researcher from New Zealand that she was explaining that some birds, marine birds, that they were flying around the patches of a plastic, and they were consuming this one because when these patches start decomposing of plastic, they start releasing some type of compounds that they are similar to fish. So they were like a yummy for them, and they were attracted to that, and they end up consuming this type of plastic. So the populations were plummeting because the consumption of this plastic. So that's one of the like a highlights. And then when they were removing, of course, the plastic were trying to prevent this damage to these birds, they saw the differences in the population. This is one of the studies I remember.
Yeah,
And
no, absolutely. Mhm.
yes, and then now let's talk a little bit about something uncomfortable, that is the Global Plastic Treaty, which was unfortunately the negotiations collapsed this year, and there wasn't any binding agreement in place. So, what this means for the ocean cleanups work, and how do you continue pushing up when actually not only corporations but developing countries don't want to compromise? What can be done and what can be changed or incorporated?
Yeah, so well, a few things here. First, I don't think it's the developing economy that don't want to compromise. I think there's actually like a coalition of the willing, and many of this country actually like willing to have a robust treaty in place. I think it's mostly the petrochemical countries, the people that produce the plastic, that is actually like dragging back a little bit. And so, I mean, yeah, the negotiation haven't sort of landed a meaningful treaty. So that was the INC 5.2 a few months ago, and I think there will be INC 5.3 early in 2026. So yeah, we're all hoping that something meaningful will come, because yeah, obviously it will impact our mission, but also generally like the state of the ocean, which is what we're working for. For the ocean cleanup, really, at this stage, things don't change, because even if a treaty was sort of like landed in this year, those things will take time to get in place. And so, our work has to continue. And this is quite often what we are sort of portraying, like we are a solution right now that is temporary. It is not our ambitions to be garbage man of the ocean for the next century and intercepting plastics in all the rivers of the world. Eventually, we don't want plastic to enter rivers. We don't want plastic to enter the ocean. And so that requires strong political will and legislation upstream. It will take a lot of time, I think. If that happens, it will take a lot of time to be implemented. In the meantime, plastic is flowing into the ocean at an increasing rate. And so it's important that we try to mitigate that crisis as much as possible. We also see that solutions that we put in place, like the interceptors in rivers, I mean, they have a great impact in terms of, removing plastic and preventing plastic from entering the ocean. But we also see it as a very strong monitoring tool and something that can help us sort of measure the efficacy of upstream measures, right? Depending on the regions where we deploy interceptors, the type of pollution is different. And so we are studying that plastic, we document everything, and then we can go back to policymakers and say, hey, we're finding this type of plastic. Maybe you can put something in place here. And if something is being put in place, over time, we can see whether our catch and the concentration of that plastic is actually decreasing, right? So it's a really good way to sort of monitor the efficacy of those political measures. But then to finish, and yeah, in terms of our mission, like right now, I mean, we rely a lot on philanthropy and donations from people. Like we would hope that one day we actually get access to more sort of institutional funding and governments and cities and regions to buy into helping us into our mission. And so I think like the treaty, could sort of enable those kind of funding. So, we're being active in following what's happening. But yeah, I think solving the plastic pollution crisis will take a lot of will and also many, many different aspects. There's not one solution. We're not by far a silver bullet solution. We have to look at the problem in different angles. So that's what the treaty should do.
And have you seen differences in policies in the countries that you have been working with, for example, in Central America?
Yeah, there is definitely. I mean, we like, for instance, we're working in Rio Motagua, which is in Guatemala. This is one of the most polluted river we've seen so far. I mean, we're talking about tsunamis of waste that just come after every big rain event, and so, like, putting a stop to that flux just makes that pollution very visible, and so it's sort of like engage a certain discussion and say, like, where is that plastic coming from? And you actually go back, and this is very specific case, that one, because I was telling you about coastal cities before, but that's river there, Rio Motagua. Actually, most of it comes from Guatemala City, and that's like 300 kilometers inland. And actually, you figure out that in Guatemala City, there's a large sort of landfill that is built very close to to the river, and putting that sort of like interception and showing, like, hey guys, like, look at what's flowing into the Gulf of Honduras every day. Spark the discussion, and so, like, improvement is being made now upstream to actually make sure that sort of waste is collected and managed in a more appropriate manner. So that's one example. But yeah, we saw that, yeah, in many different regions where we work in, the governments buying into the solution. It's like, you have an interceptor, but it's part of of a larger projects. Like, local communities are being involved. Like, I mean, we are a small organization. We're about 200 people. The mission is global. Like, we don't have the pretension to be sort of like solving the problem like globally. Like, I think what's important to see is that we are sort of in all those different countries, and there are different stories and different sort of specifics for every location, but the local communities are being involved, right? So you have an interceptor, but you have cleanups, and then you have recycling projects that are being put into place, and then, like, people are just getting involved, right? So it's more movement than just like saying, like, hey, we'll put a barrier in the river. And so we're seeing change happening, and yeah, much faster than any change that is being negotiated at UN level. That's for sure at the moment.
Wow, fascinating. Just, like a lot of activists that are quite passionate about this topic, they're saying that, governments and corporations are moving too slowly. From your perspective, you highlighted a little bit your perspective for you guys on what the perspective should be, that regulations need to take place. But what do you truly believe needs to be implemented at this particular moment, and let's say in the next 5 years, that for this crisis that is happening?
Yeah, I mean, like, about policies and laws, and things take time. I mean, 5 years, maybe for 5, 10 years, but I think, like, you look at countries, like, there's different legislation depending on the country. Some are like more useful than others. I think, I mean, removing plastic from society, it's not going to happen. Like, we have to, like, face that. But I also believe that limiting production in some ways is very important. Like, there's a lot of plastics that don't need to exist, and so we got to be smarter than that in how we handle our food, our transport. So there's work to be done there. There's a lot of, like, sort of very toxic plastic. Well, plastic is a big word, right? Like, there's so many different types of plastics, and then even in a can of plastic, depending on whether you want it, blue, red, yellow, shiny, flexible, hard, you will have extra compounds that are being added to that plastic, right? So I think there needs to be some, like, strong regulation on what is allowed and what is not allowed in terms of, like, plastic production, right? There are a lot of things that are, like, not necessary. I'll give you a good example. For instance, when we collect plastics in rivers, one of the most valuable plastic that we collect is the water bottles, like the plastic PET bottles. And why is that? Is because this is probably the one that is the most easily recycled. And it is most easily recycled because they are all the same components, the same products, right? They're all made of the same thing. Some years ago, I mean, I think it still exists in some countries, but I'll talk, for instance, in Europe. we used to have PET bottles that were like some were blue, where some were green, where some red, and so on. Now they are, by law, they all need to be sort of like made transparent. And why is this? Is because if they are all made transparent and they all have the same sort of like chemical composition, when you collect them, you can recycle them much more easily. If you collect some transparent blue, red, and yellow, and you try to make a new plastic bottle with it, the result will not be as good, right? So I think there is also an easy win there. If we cannot like get away from our addiction to plastic, at least we can try to standardize plastic objects, like packaging and so on. Why do we need to, you go to supermarkets, you don't need to have, 25 different designs of bottles and colors. Like, I mean, we, talk about shampoo, like you're interested about what's in the shampoo. And, I'm not saying we should all have the same shampoo. I understand that we can have like sort of like different products, but the containing, like the recipient could be sort of homogenized, at least in terms of like chemical signature. It would make recycling sort of like much more easy. But yeah, I mean, that's one aspect of the thing. Again, like, don't want to fall into like recycling is the solution. Like I was saying, I don't think there's any silver bullet to the plastic pollution problem. But yeah, we want to look at, sort of like all those different sort of like easy win. And there's a bunch of easy win that we can really like access. Really to have an impact at global scale, though, I think like there's a lot of investment that needs to happen in developing economies for waste management system. That's really like where the work needs to happen before anything else.
And do you think that these bioplastics, of course, it depends. Some of them are made of starch or the ones of coconut. Of course, they have like a polymers, still a percentage. Do you think that still they work? They're less pollutant? There's less damage?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, yeah, bioplastics is, I think, again, like, there's a problem of definition. What is bioplastic and what is, like, I mean, yeah, there's I think there is some innovations that are coming that are very interesting. People growing plastics out of seaweed or out of waste, like seafood waste and so on. I think it's very, very interesting as long as there is no extra chemicals that are being added to it. But then there's the question of like, yeah, what is the long term, like, is bioplastic degrading? Like how is it degrading and is it creating like a bunch of microplastics? I mean, if you still have some polymeric chains, you're still gonna have the same problem, right? And so that's the whole problem with plastic, because on one side, it's such a revolution. We love plastic. Why do we love plastic? Is because you make something out of plastic, you add water in it, or you leave it outside for the night, you come back the day after, it's still the same shape, hasn't moved, it's completely inert, right? So that's actually why we like plastic, right? But then in the same time, if you discard that into the environment, that is actually the problem, is like it doesn't go away by itself, right? And bioplastic is the same, right? It's like if either you have something that is sort of degrades very easily, but then it doesn't have the property of plastic like you like it, because you want it durable and you want something that can resist, water, air, everything, sunlight. Or you have something very durable made of, plants or whatnot. And then you have the same problem, so it's, I think, maybe it's not necessarily about the material itself, but it's about the use we have of it, like the our relationship with that material. Like plastic bags was invented for environmental reasons, right? We used to have like, tote bags or paper bags, and the cost to make a paper bag in terms of energy, water, is like so much bigger than a plastic bag. And so the inventor of the plastic bag was like, well, for like, a tenth of the cost and a tenth of the energy, I'm going to make you something that is much more durable. The problem is like, it's so cheap that we ended up like having a plastic bag and be like, cool, I just throw it away and I'm going to have a new one, and that's, I think for me, that's the problem, it's the relation we have with a plastic bag. Why don't you just, because a plastic bag is so durable, why don't you just have one plastic bag? And then you just like, just use and reuse, So it's a societal problem, I think. And it's much bigger than just saying like, hey, like we're going to replace all the coffee cups with coconut or bamboos or whatever it is, it's like, it's about like that culture of the quick and the convenience. And, I drink something, I straight away, I'm going to buy a new one because it doesn't cost me anything. And I don't care about that coffee cup that I just drank this morning. So, yeah.
Yes, I also will add that it was in the Rio Convention in the 92, if I'm not wrong, when they said that who was polluting should pay. I think that was the worst thing that could ever happen, because it's easier and cheaper for the corporations or the polluters to pay, but they are not paying for the total accumulation for years. It's not long lasting, but they're paying like a day what they found. And that, I would say, that was one of the worst thing that could have ever happened, because that
Mhm.
it was like an incentive for the corporations to do like, oh, well, for me it's cheaper to just pay the pollution instead of just having a plant or a treatment of my waste.
Mhm.
And
That's cool.
just to finalize, you have said that your work is about shifting the question from what is the state of the ocean to what can we do about it. What does that shift mean to you personally as scientist and a citizen of this planet?
I mean, I'm still interested to study, what is the state, what's happening, and so on. But sometimes, you know, we know enough to know that, we have to do something about it. And I mean, here we're talking about plastic pollution, but there's, like the environment, like the ocean is facing with so many threats, climate change and overfishing, ocean acidification, and so on, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think, there's time for science, but there's also time for action. And I mean, that's one thing that I've always liked at the Ocean Cleanup is that, we value science. It's the cornerstone of what we do initially, trying to understand the problem, but eventually it's about defining solutions and innovating and trying to do something about it. Right? And so, yeah, I mean, for, general public and people in general, just get involved, just get involved in some ways or another. There's so many things. Like, I'm not saying like, you should do everything and try to fight every battle. Like, if you try to do everything, you don't do nothing, but just choose something that you like and just get involved. And yeah, like I was saying, we work with local communities. People are willing, people want change, and so it's about, yeah, trying to change on a daily basis. But also, yeah, like we can put responsibility on the consumers and the citizens, but I also think that's, it comes from, it's a systemic problem, right? So it has to come from like larger spheres, governments, industries. So vote, you know, that's a great, go vote and act, ask for change. And if change doesn't come, like, make it happen yourself, innovate and do things, and so, yeah, I mean, if you take the case of Boyan, who founded the Ocean Cleanup, I mean, his idea, like, a lot of people came and they were like, very skeptic. And me, when the first time he contacted me in 2013, I was just like, wow, great. Do you crazy, but great, And then, 12, almost 13 years later, we're still there and things happen. And it was a rocky road with highs and lows, but things are happening and we're seeing change, So I have the hope that, within my lifetime, we can see positive change. And I think we are seeing many positive change in many sectors. So I'm hopeful.
I agree. Just everything add up. Just every tiny little action counts.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
yes, and small
Absolutely.
changes that we can do. So I agree. Thank you very much, Lauren. It has been a
Yeah.
pleasure having you here. This episode was inspired by Lauren's dedication to turning data into action and by his tireless work to make the invisible visible, the currents of plastic that move through our rivers, our oceans, and ultimately our lives. His story is a call not just to clean, but to change, to ask better questions, to demand more from systems, and to hold on to hope, even when the politics fall short. because the science keeps showing us the way forward.
We're also excited to share that Science Behind the Glass now lives on a new platform that connects the podcast to all major streaming services via RSS. Just click the link in the description to find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, YouTube, and wherever you love to listen to.
Science Behind the Glass is an independent podcast created and hosted by me, Linda Hernandez Duran, together with Daniel Esguerra, with the invaluable support of our dedicated and today co-host, technical director Rafael Giordano, and original music by our colleague and friend Bernardo Aguila.
Follow us on Instagram, X, Facebook, LinkedIn, and TikTok, and visit our website at sciencebehindtheglass.com for more stories, updates, and resources.
Don't forget to subscribe and share this podcast with your friends and communities. Let's amplify these narratives together.
And if this episode inspires you, consider supporting us with a contribution via PayPal. Just click the Support Us button on our website. Your support helps us grow and ensures we continue illuminating the human side of science. Bye for now.